The sun was setting over Chicago, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The city hummed with life as people hurried to their destinations, oblivious to the storm brewing behind closed doors. In a modest office on the 7th floor of the Federal Bureau of Investigation building, Daniel Carter sat at his desk, his eyes glued to a stack of papers scattered in front of him. His face was tense, his jaw clenched tightly as he flipped through the documents. Daniel wasn't your typical FBI agent. Sure, he had the same sharp suit and polished shoes as everyone else, but there was something different about him. He had a reputation for being relentless, almost obsessive when it came to solving cases. Some called him dedicated, others whispered that he was too suspicious for his own good. But no one could deny that he got results. That was why he was assigned to one of the most sensitive investigations the Bureau had seen in years, an inquiry into General Richard Hayes, a decorated Army officer accused of corruption. General Hayes was a towering figure in the military world. With medals lining his uniform and decades of service under his belt, he was the kind of man who commanded respect wherever he went. His name carried weight, and his influence reached far beyond the confines of the armed forces. Yet, here he was, entangled in allegations of mishandling classified technology, a scandal that threatened not only his career, but also national security. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The more he read, the angrier he became. It wasn't just the accusations themselves that bothered him, it was the pattern. Over the years, he had seen too many cases where powerful people used their positions to cover up wrongdoing. Each time it felt like a personal betrayal. To Daniel, justice wasn't just a job, it was a mission. And every time someone abused their authority, it chipped away at the foundation of trust he believed society needed to function. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 7 o'clock and the office was mostly empty. Most agents had already gone home, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He sighed and reached for his coffee mug, only to find it empty. Setting it down with a frustrated thud, he stood up and grabbed his coat. Maybe a walk would help clear his head. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Daniel stuffed his hands into his pockets and began walking aimlessly, letting the cool breeze wash over him. As he passed by restaurants and shops, his mind kept circling back to General Hayes. Something about this case felt different. The evidence was sparse, just fragments of emails and financial records, but Daniel's instincts told him there was more to uncover. He couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was hiding something big. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him out of his thoughts. Pulling it out, he saw a text message from Susan Meyer, the director of the FBI. "Update me tomorrow morning," it read. Short and to the point, just like her. Daniel groaned inwardly. He knew she expected progress, but so far, all he had were suspicions and dead ends. Still, he couldn't afford to let her down. Not again. The next day, Daniel arrived, at work early, determined to dig deeper. He spent hours poring over files, cross-referencing names, dates, and transactions. By mid-afternoon, he stumbled upon something interesting, a series of payments made to a shell company linked to Hayes's division. The amounts weren't huge, but they were consistent, suggesting a steady flow of funds. Daniel's heart raced as he jotted down notes. This could be the break he needed. As the week went on, Daniel's frustration grew. Every lead seemed to hit a wall, blocked by red tape or vague explanations. The higher-ups weren't making things easy for him either. When he requested access to additional records, he was met with resistance. "You're chasing ghosts," one colleague warned him. Hayes is untouchable, but Daniel refused to give up. If anything, their skepticism only fueled his determination. He started working late nights, combing through every scrap of information he could find. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford, and meals were often skipped altogether. His focus was singular, proving that Hayes wasn't as clean as he claimed to be. Meanwhile, General Hayes remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny he was under. Life for him continued as usual, meetings, briefings, and ceremonial appearances. On a chilly Friday evening, he attended a formal gala hosted by a veterans organization. Dressed in his full uniform, he cut an imposing figure as he mingled with guests. At his side was Lieutenant Laura Bennett, a young officer tasked with assisting him during public events. Laura was smart, capable, and fiercely loyal. She admired Hayes, both as a leader and as a mentor. To her, he represented everything noble about the military: discipline, honor, and sacrifice. As they moved through the crowded room, she listened intently as he shared stories of his time in service, laughing at his jokes and nodding at his insights. For a moment, it felt like nothing could touch them. But outside the venue, trouble was brewing. Daniel had decided to attend the gala uninvited, hoping to catch Hayes off guard. He hadn't planned on confronting him directly. That wasn't his style. But seeing the general surrounded by admirers ignited a fire within him. How could someone accused of such serious crimes still command so much respect? It didn't seem fair. As the event drew to a close, Hayes and Laura stepped outside, chatting casually as they headed toward their car. That's when Daniel appeared, stepping out of the shadows. His expression was grim, his eyes blazing with intensity. Hayes stopped in his tracks, surprised to see the agent standing there. "General Hayes," Daniel said, his voice cold and clipped. "We need to talk." Hayes raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the intrusion. "Agent Carter, I presume? What can I do for you?" Daniel ignored the question, launching instead into a tirade about the allegations against Hayes. Words spilled out, of him in a torrent, accusations, frustrations, and thinly veiled threats. Hayes listened patiently, his demeanor calm but firm. Beside him, Laura shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to intervene. "You think you're above the law, Daniel?" spat, his voice rising. "But I'm going to prove otherwise." Hayes finally spoke, his tone measured. "Agent Carter, if you have evidence, bring it forward. Until then, these baseless accusations are beneath both of us." The comment struck a nerve. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment it looked like he might lose control. Laura stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "That's enough," she said firmly. "This isn't the place or the time." For a brief second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final glare, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Hayes and Laura standing in stunned silence. Neither of them realized it yet, but this encounter was just the beginning of a much larger conflict, one that would test their principles, their loyalties, and ultimately, their humanity. The confrontation outside the gala lingered in everyone's minds like a storm cloud that refused to pass. For General Richard Hayes, it was an unsettling reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. He had spent decades building his reputation, earning medals and accolades for his service to the country. Yet now he found himself embroiled in accusations that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. Though he tried to brush off Daniel Carter's outburst as the rantings of an overzealous agent, deep down he couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at him. Lieutenant Laura Bennett, on the other hand, couldn't shake the image of Daniel standing there, his face twisted with anger. She had seen plenty of tense situations during her time in the military, but something about that moment felt different. It wasn't just the words Daniel had spoken, it was the raw emotion behind them. He wasn't just accusing Hayes, he was challenging the very foundation of trust that held their system together. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, briefings, and media inquiries. News of the incident leaked almost immediately, sparking a frenzy of speculation. Headlines blared across newspapers and TV screens. FBI agent confronts Army general over corruption allegations. Public opinion was divided. Some praised Daniel for standing up to authority, while others condemned him for what they saw as reckless behavior. Hayes tried to stay focused on his duties, but the constant attention made it difficult. Everywhere he went, people whispered, stared, or avoided eye contact altogether. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter returned to his office, more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The encounter with Hayes had left him shaken, not because of any guilt or regret, but because it confirmed his worst fears. In his mind, Hayes's calm demeanor wasn't proof of innocence, it was evidence of arrogance. How could someone accused of such serious crimes remain so composed, To Daniel, it was further proof that the general believed himself untouchable. His obsession with the case consumed him. Days turned into nights as he pored over files, cross-referencing data and chasing leads. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Gone was the sharp, confident agent who once commanded respect. In his place was a man driven by desperation, willing to push boundaries and bend rules if it meant getting closer to the truth. Susan Meyer, the FBI director, called him into her office one afternoon. "Daniel," she began, her tone firm but not unkind. "I need you to focus. This case is important, yes, but we can't afford another scene like the one at the gala." "I'm doing my job," Daniel replied, his voice tight. "If you're telling me to back off, then fine, but don't expect me to sit around while someone abuses their power." Meyer sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew Daniel well enough to recognize the stubbornness in his voice. Arguing with him would only make things worse. Instead, she handed him a folder. "Here's some new intel. Use it wisely." Daniel took the folder without a word and left the room, already flipping through its contents. Inside were transcripts of intercepted communications between Hayes's division and various contractors. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, just routine business dealings. But as Daniel read deeper, patterns began to emerge. Payments, shipments, and coded phrases hinted at something far more sinister. His pulse quickened. This was it, the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. Across town, Hayes prepared for a routine meeting with federal agents at Fort Sherman. These gatherings were standard procedure, designed to ensure transparency between different branches of government. But this time, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Agents from the FBI, Department of Defense, and other agencies filed into the conference room, exchanging wary glances. Hayes sat at the head of the table, flanked by Laura and a few trusted advisors. As the meeting began, discussions revolved around procurement processes and budget allocations. Most of the questions directed at Hayes were routine, but Daniel seized the opportunity to press harder. When his turn came, he leaned forward, fixing Hayes with an intense stare. "General Hayes," he began, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Can you explain these discrepancies in your division's financial records?" Hayes glanced at the documents Daniel slid across the table. "Agent Carter, I assure you all transactions were authorized and accounted for. If there are inconsistencies, they're likely clerical errors." "Clerical errors?" Daniel repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's convenient." Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She could feel the temperature rising, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Other agents exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of how to intervene. Hayes, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Are you suggesting I'm lying, Agent Carter?" Hayes asked, his voice steady. "I'm suggesting you have a lot to answer for," Daniel shot back. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the two men, locked in a battle of wills. Hayes' composure only fueled Daniel's frustration. He clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep his emotions in check. But as the questioning continued, his patience wore thin. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Before anyone could react, he reached for his holster and drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Hayes. Gasps erupted around the room as everyone froze, unsure of what to do next. "Enough games!" Daniel shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you're above the law, but I'm not afraid to bring you down." Laura instinctively stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Agent Carter, please," she pleaded. "This isn't the way." Her words seemed to echo in the stunned silence. Hayes didn't flinch, his gaze locked onto Daniel's. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then slowly, senior officers moved to intervene, their voices overlapping as they urged Daniel to lower his weapon. Reluctantly, he complied, though his glare never wavered. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived, disarming Daniel and escorting him out of the room. As he was led away, Hayes finally broke his silence. "Take care of him," he said simply, his tone betraying neither triumph nor anger. Back at FBI headquarters, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Agents gathered in hushed clusters discussing what had happened. Some expressed sympathy for Daniel, believing he had been pushed too far. Others condemned his actions, calling them reckless and dangerous. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in a holding cell, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, justice, and the cost of standing up for what he believed in. For Hayes, the fallout was equally profound. Though he maintained his composure in public, privately, he wrestled with doubts. Was he truly innocent, or had he become complacent in a system riddled with flaws? And what did this mean for the future? Not just for him, but for the institution he had devoted his life to. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. The confrontation between Daniel Carter and General Hayes was far from over. It had ignited a chain reaction, setting the stage for a larger battle that would test the limits of power, loyalty, and morality. Neither man realized it yet, but their fates were intertwined in ways neither could have imagined. The days following the incident at Fort Sherman felt like they dragged on forever. The weight of what had happened hung heavily over everyone involved, casting long shadows that stretched far beyond the walls of the conference room. For Daniel Carter, sitting alone in a holding cell, time seemed to slow down. His mind replayed the events over and over again. The heated exchange, the moment he drew his weapon, the shocked faces of those around him. He tried to justify his actions, telling himself that he was doing what needed to be done. But deep down, doubt crept in. Had he crossed a line, or had he simply been pushed too far? Outside the cell, the FBI moved quickly to contain the fallout. Director Susan Meyer called an emergency meeting with senior agents, her expression grim as she addressed the room. "This is a mess," she said bluntly, her voice carrying a mix of frustration and concern. "We need answers, and we need them fast." To lead the internal investigation into Daniel's conduct, she assigned Agent Chris Monroe, a seasoned investigator known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. Chris wasn't thrilled about the assignment. Digging into the actions of a fellow agent was never easy, but he understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the reputation of the entire bureau. Chris began by reviewing surveillance footage from the meeting at Fort Sherman. The video showed Daniel's escalating behavior in stark detail: the clenched fists, the raised voice, the sudden movement toward his holster. It was undeniable that his actions had been reckless. But as Chris watched the footage again and again, something caught his attention. There was a flicker of hesitation in Daniel's eyes before he drew his weapon, a moment of uncertainty that suggested he hadn't planned this act of defiance. Next, Chris turned to Daniel's files on General Hayes. What he found surprised him. The accusations against Hayes weren't baseless. There were legitimate concerns about discrepancies in financial records and procurement processes. While none of the evidence pointed directly to criminal activity, it painted a picture of someone operating in gray areas, areas where rules could be bent or ignored if you had enough power. Chris also interviewed witnesses from the meeting, including Lieutenant Laura Bennett. Laura sat across from him in a quiet office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I don't think Agent Carter intended to harm anyone," she said, after a pause. But he was clearly frustrated. "I've seen soldiers lose their cool under pressure, but this was different." "Different how?" Chris asked, leaning forward slightly. Laura hesitated, weighing her response. It felt personal, like he had a vendetta against General Hayes, or maybe against authority figures in general. Her observation struck a chord with Chris. As he dug deeper into Daniel's background, he uncovered a pattern of behavior that shed light on his motivations. Years earlier, Daniel had been part of an investigation into a corrupt politician who had used his influence to cover up illegal activities. Despite gathering substantial evidence, the case was shut down due to political interference. That failure had left a scar, fueling Daniel's distrust of powerful individuals and his belief that justice often came second to privilege. Meanwhile, General Hayes found himself navigating a storm of his own. Though he hadn't been arrested, or formally charged, the scandal surrounding him dominated headlines. Public opinion remained divided. with some defending him as a victim of baseless accusations and others calling for accountability. Within the military, whispers of discontent grew louder. Officers who once admired Hayes now questioned whether his leadership style had contributed to the situation. To manage the crisis, Hayes retained Matthew Cole, a civilian attorney with a reputation for handling high-profile cases. Matthew wasted no time diving into the details, poring over documents and scrutinizing every aspect of Hayes's career. At first glance, Hayes appeared clean. No smoking guns, no blatant violations of the law. But as Matthew dug deeper, he discovered minor infractions that, while not criminal, raised eyebrows. Unreported gifts from contractors, questionable travel reimbursements, and vague explanations for certain expenditures hinted at a lack of transparency. Matthew didn't sugarcoat his findings when he met with Hayes. "General," he said bluntly, "you're walking a fine line here. Even if nothing sticks legally, these issues will damage your credibility." Hayes nodded, his expression troubled. "I understand," he replied. "But I swear to you, I've never done anything to jeopardize national security or betray my oath." Matthew believed him, at least partially. Still, he knew perception mattered as much as reality. To salvage Hayes's reputation, they would need to address these concerns head-on. As the investigation progressed, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Laura, torn between loyalty to Hayes and her duty to uphold integrity, confided in Chris during one of their interviews. "There's something else," she admitted hesitantly. "Before the meeting at Fort Sherman, I overheard General Hayes speaking privately with someone. I couldn't make out everything they said, but it sounded like they were discussing classified technology." Chris leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Do you remember anything specific?" She shook her head. "Just fragments. Words like prototype and authorization. It was cryptic, but it stuck with me." Her testimony added another layer of complexity to the case. If Hayes was involved in discussions about sensitive technology without proper clearance, it could explain some of the irregularities in his division's records. Yet proving such involvement would require more than hearsay. It would take concrete evidence. Back at FBI headquarters, Daniel faced disciplinary hearings. The atmosphere was tense, with agents divided over whether his actions warranted severe punishment or leniency. Some argued that pointing a gun at a high-ranking official was unforgivable, regardless of the circumstances. Others pointed to the systemic issues Daniel had been trying to expose, suggesting that his methods, though extreme, were driven by a desire for justice. Throughout the proceedings, Daniel maintained a stoic demeanor, refusing to apologize or defend himself vigorously. When pressed about his motives, he simply stated, "I did what I thought was right." His resolve earned him respect from some quarters, even among those who disagreed with his tactics. But it also hardened the stance of those determined to hold him accountable. By the end of the week, it became clear that Daniel's future with the FBI was uncertain. Suspension seemed inevitable, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Amidst the chaos, Chris uncovered a piece of information that shifted the narrative entirely. Buried in Daniel's emails was a series of anonymous messages sent to him shortly before the confrontation at Fort Sherman. These messages contained vague but troubling hints about corruption within the military hierarchy, specifically targeting Hayes. They were unsigned and untraceable, written in fragmented sentences designed to provoke rather than inform. Chris flagged the messages for further analysis, suspecting they might have played a role in Daniel's decision-making. If true, it raised uncomfortable questions. Was Daniel acting on genuine concerns, or had he been manipulated by someone with ulterior motives? And if so, who stood to gain from pitting an agent against a decorated general? The revelation sent ripples through the investigation, forcing both sides to reconsider their positions. For Hayes, it provided a potential explanation for the scrutiny he had faced, not personal wrongdoing, but a calculated smear campaign. For Daniel, it offered a lifeline, suggesting that his suspicions might not have been entirely unfounded. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, one thing became clear. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. What started as a clash between two men had evolved into a web of intrigue, involving shadowy figures, hidden agendas, and questions about the very foundations of trust and accountability. Neither Daniel nor Hayes realized it yet, but their fates were intertwined in ways that would force them to confront not only each other, but also themselves. The investigation into the events at Fort Sherman deepened, pulling in threads that seemed to lead in every direction. Agent Chris Monroe found himself caught in the middle of a tangled web, trying to piece together the truth while navigating conflicting narratives and hidden motives. Every new discovery raised more questions than answers, making it clear that this case was far from straightforward. Chris spent long hours poring over the anonymous messages sent to Daniel Carter. They were cryptic, filled with half-truths and veiled accusations, but they hinted at something bigger, a deliberate attempt to destabilize trust between the FBI and the military. The language used was calculated, designed to provoke anger and suspicion. Whoever had sent them knew exactly how to push Daniel's buttons, exploiting his history of distrust toward authority figures. To trace the origin of these messages, Chris worked closely with the Bureau's cybersecurity team. Days turned into nights as they analyzed metadata, IP addresses, and encryption patterns. Finally, they uncovered a crucial clue. The messages had been routed through multiple servers across different countries, masking their true source. But one thing stood out. The final relay point before reaching Daniel's inbox was located in Eastern Europe, a region known for harboring foreign operatives. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation. If the messages were part of a foreign interference campaign, then both Daniel and General Hayes might have been unwitting pawns in a larger game. Chris immediately reported his findings to Director Susan Meyer, who listened intently, her expression growing grimmer with each word. "This changes everything," she said after a moment of silence. "We're not just dealing with internal corruption anymore. This could be an attack on our institutions." Meanwhile, Matthew Cole continued building General Hayes's defense strategy. While the general hadn't been formally charged with any crimes, the allegations against him had already damaged his reputation. Matthew knew that clearing Hayes's name would require more than legal arguments. It would take a public relations campaign to restore faith in his integrity. Matthew decided to tackle the issue head-on. He arranged a press conference where Hayes would address the accusations directly, answering questions from reporters in a transparent manner. It was risky. Any misstep could make things worse, but Matthew believed honesty was their best chance at redemption. At the press conference, Hayes stood behind a podium, flanked by Matthew and Lieutenant Laura Bennett. Cameras flashed as journalists fired questions at him, some accusatory, others curious. Hayes remained composed, speaking slowly and deliberately. "I understand the concerns surrounding my division's financial records," he began. "While I admit there may have been administrative oversights, I assure you that no laws were broken and no national security risks were created. I welcome a full and fair investigation into these matters because I have nothing to hide." His words resonated with some, but skepticism lingered. Skeptics pointed to the minor infractions uncovered by Matthew, arguing that even small breaches of protocol undermined accountability. Still, Hayes's willingness to face scrutiny earned him cautious respect from those who valued transparency. Back at the FBI, Chris presented his findings about the anonymous messages to Daniel during another round of questioning. For the first time since his arrest, Daniel showed genuine interest, leaning forward as Chris explained the connection to foreign operatives. "You're telling me someone set me up?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's possible," Chris replied. "These messages were crafted to manipulate your emotions, to make you act impulsively. You weren't thinking clearly when you confronted Hayes. That's exactly what they wanted." Daniel sat back, his mind racing. The idea that he had been used stung deeply, but it also aligned with his suspicions about systemic corruption. If foreign forces were targeting American institutions, then his instincts hadn't been entirely wrong. They'd just been misdirected. Laura, too, played a pivotal role in unraveling the mystery. During a follow-up interview with Chris, she revealed additional details about the private conversation she had overheard between Hayes and an unknown individual. Though fragmented, the discussion revolved around classified technology and its potential applications. Laura couldn't identify the other person, but she remembered hearing frustration in Hayes's voice, a tone she rarely associated with him. Chris shared this information with intelligence agencies, sparking a parallel investigation into whether sensitive military projects had been compromised. Analysts combed through classified files, searching for signs of unauthorized access or data leaks. What they found was alarming. Several prototypes developed by Hayes's division had gone missing from inventory logs, listed as decommissioned, without proper documentation. This discovery sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. Senior officers convened emergency meetings to assess the damage and determine how such lapses had occurred. Some suspected insider involvement, while others pointed fingers at external actors. The lack of clarity only added to the tension, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. As the investigations converged, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The anonymous messages, the missing prototypes, and the financial discrepancies all pointed to a coordinated effort to exploit weaknesses within America's defense systems. Foreign operatives had identified vulnerabilities, not just in technology but in human behavior, and exploited them to sow discord. For Daniel, the realization hit hard. He had allowed his anger and frustration to cloud his judgment, playing right into the hands of those seeking to undermine the system. His actions had caused harm, not only to himself but also to the people he sought to protect. Yet, despite his mistakes, he wasn't ready to give up. If anything, the stakes felt higher now. Susan Meyer recognized the shift in Daniel's attitude and decided to offer him a chance at redemption. She approached him one evening, finding him sitting alone in an empty office, staring at a stack of papers. "Agent Carter," she said gently, "we need your help." Daniel looked up, surprised. "My help?" "Yes. You've seen firsthand how dangerous these tactics can be. We want you to assist in identifying and neutralizing the foreign operatives behind this operation." Daniel hesitated, weighing the offer. On one hand, it was an opportunity to redeem himself and contribute to something greater. On the other hand, it meant working closely with the same organization that had labeled him reckless and unstable. After a moment of silence, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "But not for you. For justice." With Daniel on board, the FBI launched a joint task force with military intelligence to track down the culprits. Using the breadcrumbs left by the anonymous messages, they traced connections to a network of spies operating under diplomatic cover. Raids conducted in coordination with international allies led to several arrests, though key players remained elusive. General Hayes, meanwhile, faced disciplinary action for the minor infractions tied to his financial disclosures. While not severe, enough to warrant criminal charges, they tarnished his legacy and forced him to step away from active duty. In retirement, he dedicated himself to mentoring young officers, sharing lessons learned from his experience. Though humbled, he remained committed to serving his country in whatever capacity he could. Laura emerged as a hero of sorts, praised for her bravery and honesty. Her testimony had been instrumental in exposing the truth, earning her a promotion and renewed trust from her peers. She carried the weight of recent events with quiet dignity, determined to uphold the values she believed in. As the dust settled, the scandal left lasting scars on everyone involved. Trust had been tested, reputations questioned, and careers altered. But amidst the wreckage, glimmers of hope emerged. The collaboration between the FBI and the military demonstrated the power of unity in the face of adversity. And for Daniel, Hayes, and Laura, the ordeal served as a reminder that justice required not just passion but patience, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The trial of Daniel Carter became the talk of the nation, dominating headlines and sparking heated debates. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle, a clash of ideologies that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and justice. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, spectators and analysts eager to dissect every word spoken during the proceedings. For Daniel, it was both a reckoning and an opportunity to prove that his actions, though extreme, had been driven by a desire to expose corruption. The prosecution painted Daniel as reckless and dangerous, emphasizing the gravity of pointing a firearm at a high-ranking military official. "This is not about passion or principle," the prosecutor argued. "This is about breaking the law in the most egregious way possible." Agent Carter abandoned his training, his duty, and his oath when he drew his weapon. Daniel sat quietly, in the courtroom, listening without flinching. He knew the charges against him were serious, perhaps even career-ending, but he refused to let fear dictate his response. His defense attorney, Ellen Parker, took a different approach, framing Daniel's actions within the broader context of systemic failures. "Agent Carter didn't wake up one day and decide to point a gun at General Hayes for no reason," Ellen said during her opening statement. "He was pushed to this moment by years of frustration, by watching powerful individuals exploit their positions while ordinary citizens paid the price. Yes, his methods were wrong. But we must ask ourselves, why did he feel so desperate that he believed this was the only way to be heard?" Ellen's words resonated with some in the courtroom, particularly those who had followed the case closely. Evidence presented by Chris Monroe and the FBI's cybersecurity team supported her argument. The anonymous messages traced back to foreign operatives revealed a calculated effort to manipulate Daniel, exploiting his distrust of authority figures to create chaos. This revelation shifted public opinion slightly, with some viewing Daniel less as a rogue agent and more as a victim of circumstance. General Hayes attended the trial occasionally, sitting stoically in the gallery. Though he hadn't been charged with any crimes, his presence loomed large over the proceedings. Testimonies from Lieutenant Laura Bennett and others highlighted his calm demeanor during the confrontation at Fort Sherman, portraying him as a man unfairly targeted by suspicion. Yet, the minor infractions uncovered in his financial disclosures cast a shadow over his otherwise spotless record. Matthew Cole, Hayes' attorney, seized on these details to argue that the general had been scapegoated. "My client has served this country honorably for decades," Matthew said during cross-examination. "Yes, there were administrative oversights, mistakes made in good faith, but nothing that warrants the level of scrutiny and accusation he has faced. If anyone should be held accountable, it's the foreign actors who orchestrated this entire debacle." As the trial progressed, tensions simmered outside the courthouse. Protesters gathered daily, holding signs that read everything from "Justice for Accountability" to "Free Daniel Carter." Some viewed him as a whistleblower standing up to corruption, while others saw him as a loose cannon who had crossed a line. Debates spilled onto social media, with hashtags trending across platforms. The divide reflected deeper societal questions about trust in institutions and the lengths people were willing to go to demand change. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Witnesses testified under intense questioning, their words scrutinized for inconsistencies. Laura's testimony stood out, not because of dramatic revelations, but because of her honesty. She described overhearing Hayes' cryptic conversation about classified technology, admitting that she couldn't recall specifics, but felt compelled to share what she remembered. Her vulnerability struck a chord with jurors, reinforcing the complexity of the case. Chris Monroe also took the stand, explaining the technical aspects of tracing the anonymous messages. Using visual aids, he walked the jury through the process of identifying the Eastern European relay point and connecting it to known foreign operatives. His calm, methodical delivery helped demystify the evidence, making it accessible to laypeople. By the time he finished, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs of understanding. For Daniel, the most challenging part of the trial came when he was called to testify. Dressed in a simple suit, he walked slowly to the witness stand, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. Ellen guided him through his testimony, allowing him to explain his motivations without sounding defensive. "I've spent my career trying to protect this country," Daniel began, his voice steady. "But too often, I've seen cases where justice is denied because someone powerful pulls strings. When I started investigating General Hayes, I believed I was doing my job. Then I received those messages, They played on my fears, my doubts. I thought I was uncovering something big, something that could change things. Instead, I ended up making a terrible mistake. His admission brought a hush over the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, weighing his sincerity against the severity of his actions. The prosecution pressed him hard, highlighting moments where he ignored protocol and escalated conflicts unnecessarily. But Daniel remained composed, acknowledging his errors without excusing them. By the time closing arguments arrived, the stakes felt impossibly high. The prosecution reiterated the dangers of allowing agents to act outside the law, warning that unchecked behavior could undermine the very system they sought to protect. Ellen countered by urging the jury to consider the bigger picture, the systemic issues that had driven Daniel to such extremes, and the foreign interference that had exploited those weaknesses. After days of deliberation, the verdict came down. Guilty on charges of misconduct, but with mitigating circumstances due to the role of foreign manipulation. The judge sentenced Daniel to a reduced term in federal prison, followed by probation, contingent upon his cooperation with ongoing investigations into the operatives behind the scandal. The ruling sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed it as a fair compromise, recognizing both Daniel's wrongdoing and the external forces that influenced him. Others criticized it as too lenient, arguing that pointing a gun at a general deserved harsher punishment. Regardless of opinions, the decision marked a turning point, not just for Daniel but for everyone involved. In the aftermath, General Hayes stepped away from public life, retreating to a quiet retirement. Though cleared of criminal wrongdoing, the scandal left its mark, tarnishing his legacy and forcing him to reflect on his leadership style. He threw himself into mentoring young officers, sharing lessons learned from his experience. While he never fully regained the trust he once commanded, he found solace in knowing he had contributed to exposing the truth. Laura emerged stronger from the ordeal, earning recognition for her integrity and courage. Promoted to a higher rank, she became a symbol of hope within the military, a reminder that honesty and accountability mattered. Her relationship with Hayes deepened as well, built on mutual respect and shared struggles. Daniel, meanwhile, entered prison determined to make amends. During his sentence, he worked closely with intelligence agencies, providing insights into the tactics used by foreign operatives to exploit American vulnerabilities. His cooperation led to several breakthroughs, including the dismantling of a major spy ring operating under diplomatic cover. Slowly, grudgingly, he earned cautious respect from former critics. Outside the walls of the courtroom, the scandal prompted sweeping reforms. The FBI implemented stricter oversight protocols for investigations involving high-profile individuals, ensuring that evidence was thoroughly vetted before accusations were made. Military leaders reviewed procurement processes, addressing gaps that had allowed discrepancies to go unnoticed. Public discourse shifted, with more emphasis placed on transparency and accountability. For Daniel, Hayes, and Laura, the trial represented a chance to confront their flaws and grow. They had entered the saga as adversaries, bound by mistrust and misunderstanding. But through the crucible of investigation and judgment, they emerged transformed, scarred, yes, but also wiser. Justice, they realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, messy and imperfect, requiring constant vigilance and humility. As Daniel served his sentence, he often thought about the choices that had led him here. He regretted losing control, letting anger cloud his judgment. But he also recognized that his instincts hadn't been entirely wrong. Corruption existed and it thrived in silence. By speaking out, even imperfectly, he had shone a light on hidden truths, forcing the system to confront its own weaknesses. And perhaps, he thought that was worth something. The months following the trial passed slowly, each day a reminder of the scars left behind by the scandal. For Daniel Carter, life inside the prison walls was a mix of monotony and reflection. He spent his days working with intelligence agencies, helping them piece together the puzzle of foreign interference that had ensnared him and General Hayes. The work gave him purpose, a chance to channel his frustration into something productive. But at night, when the lights dimmed and silence filled the cell block, his thoughts drifted back to the events that had landed him here. Daniel replayed the confrontation at Fort Sherman over and over again in his mind. He saw himself drawing his weapon, heard the sharp intake of breath from those around him, felt the weight of all the eyes on him as he pointed the gun at Hayes. It wasn't pride or defiance that lingered. It was regret. Not for standing up to power, but for letting his emotions override his judgment. He had always believed justice required boldness, but now he understood it also demanded patience and restraint. Still, there were moments of hope. His cooperation with the FBI and military intelligence had yielded significant results. Several operatives tied to the Eastern European network were arrested, their activities exposed. Classified documents recovered during raids revealed plans to exploit vulnerabilities in American institutions, not just militarily, but politically and economically. The scandal had been part of something much larger, a coordinated effort to destabilize trust in authority. Knowing he had played a role in stopping it brought Daniel a small measure of peace. Outside the prison, life moved forward, though the ripple effects of the scandal continued to shape the lives of those involved. General Richard Hayes adjusted to retirement, spending his days mentoring young officers and writing articles about leadership and ethics. At first, stepping away from active duty felt like a loss. His identity had been so deeply tied to his rank and service. But over time, he found fulfillment in sharing his experiences, teaching others how to navigate the complexities of power without compromising integrity. Hayes often thought about Daniel, wondering what might have happened if circumstances had been different. Though he still couldn't condone pointing a gun at him, he respected the agent's determination to root out corruption. In a way, Daniel's actions had forced Hayes to confront uncomfortable truths about his own career, the compromises he hadn't even realized he was making. Retirement gave him the space to reflect, to ensure that his legacy would be one of accountability rather than privilege. Lieutenant Laura Bennett thrived in her new role, rising quickly through the ranks thanks to her courage and honesty during the investigation. Her promotion came with challenges, of course, more responsibilities, higher expectations, but she embraced them with the same dedication she had shown throughout the scandal. She became a trusted advisor to senior officers, advocating for transparency and ethical decision-making. Her testimony at the trial had earned her respect across branches of government, cementing her reputation as someone who put principle above politics. Laura visited Hayes regularly, their bond strengthened by shared adversity. During these visits, they often discussed the lessons learned from the scandal. "It's strange," Hayes admitted one afternoon over coffee. "I spent my whole career thinking I was doing everything right. Now I realize I could have done more, asked tougher questions, pushed harder for answers." "You're human," Laura replied gently. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." Hayes nodded, grateful for her perspective. He knew she was right. No one emerged unscathed from such an ordeal, but resilience came from growth, not perfection. As the months turned into years, public interest in the scandal faded, replaced by newer headlines and crises. Yet its impact endured, shaping policies and attitudes long after the names of those involved stopped appearing in the news. The FBI implemented reforms to prevent similar incidents, requiring stricter oversight for cases involving high-profile individuals. Military leaders adopted stricter protocols for procurement and financial disclosures, ensuring greater transparency. These changes didn't erase the flaws in the system, but they represented progress, a step toward rebuilding trust. For Daniel, release from prison marked the beginning of a new chapter. His sentence ended earlier than expected due to good behavior and his contributions to the investigation. Stepping outside on a crisp autumn morning, he squinted at the sunlight, feeling both relief and apprehension. Freedom was a gift, but it also carried responsibility. He knew re-entering society wouldn't be easy. The stigma of his actions would follow him wherever he went. But Daniel wasn't alone. Ellen Parker, his defense attorney, helped him secure a position with a nonprofit organization focused on government accountability. It wasn't glamorous work, but it aligned with his values. He spent his days researching systemic issues, advocating for transparency, and mentoring young activists eager to make a difference. Slowly, he rebuilt his life, earning cautious acceptance from colleagues and friends. One evening, as he stood outside a courthouse where he had once faced judgment, Daniel watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The scene reminded him of the day he confronted Hayes, the world holding its breath as two men clashed over principles neither fully understood. So much had changed since then, not just in his life, but in the lives of everyone touched by the scandal. Daniel allowed himself a rare smile. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Justice never was. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not because he had been vindicated, but because he finally understood what real justice meant. It wasn't about winning or losing, about proving someone wrong or right. It was about balance, collaboration, and the willingness to listen, even to those you disagreed with. Across town, Hayes sat on his porch, reading a letter from a young officer he had mentored. The words were heartfelt, thanking him for guidance and inspiration. Hayes smiled, folding the paper carefully and setting it aside. Nearby, Laura walked her dog, waving as she passed his house. Their paths crossed briefly, a nod of acknowledgement passing between them. In their own ways, they had all moved forward, carrying the lessons of the past with them. The scandal had tested them, forcing them to confront their flaws and fears. But it had also taught them something valuable, that justice wasn't a victory to be claimed, but a journey to be shared. And though the road was long and uncertain, they walked it together, committed to building a future defined not by division but by understanding.